Hi, I'm Andrew Marshall, and I'm going to give you some Ableton tips that have helped me with my live rig setup while I'm on the road. This video is meant to give you some technical tools to help you realize the creative vision of the artist that you're working with in a modern pop or electronic context. Let's get into it. A lot of these things I learned on tour, on the fly, sometimes very quickly and in some high pressure situations, so it's my goal to save you a little bit of pain. If you're still looking for answers after you watch this video, connect with me on Lander Network and I can help you with your project. Any effect that can be automated in the studio can also be automated live. And one of my favorite things to do is pitch shift samples. You hear this all over pop music and trap music, especially with 808 kicks and snares. So I have a drum rack here and I've loaded some samples into it. One of them is an 808 snare. And I set my SPD up to play this. I can use the transpose knob on the simpler device to change the pitch. To play this live, I can map the knob on my SPD to the knob on the simpler. To do that, I'm going to go into MIDI map mode, select the parameter, and turn the knob. This creates a MIDI mapping. The range by default is pretty wide for this type of thing, so I'm going to change it to like -12 to 20. That's a little more normal. Now I can just turn the knob. I can also automate this. First I'm going to put it up to 20, where it starts, and I'm going to right click and show automation in a new lane. Now let's say we have a phrase here and we want this fill to happen in the last bar. So I'm going to put a point there and we're going to pull it down all the way to -12. And right before it, we want it to be at 0 because that's where it is in the beat at its normal pitch, and right after. One last thing about these type of fills is that a lot of times the slope is not as steep in the first part. Like the pitch changes faster in the second part of the fill. So I'm going to do something like that, roll the click, and see how it sounds. Great. Now I have two hands to play the fill and I don't have to turn a knob. I also have some 808s loaded into this drum rack in an instrument rack. They're all different pitches and there's chain selector automation to play through a bass line. I'm going to play each one separately. And I'll show the automation as well. So this is our bassline automation, and it's fairly involved for chain selector stuff, but it's a pretty quick bassline and you just do what you got to do to play the part. So I'll play the bassline alone. And combined with our snare automation, sounds like this. Awesome. When you're playing with triggers on your drums, you have to treat them differently than pads, because if you send a trigger into Ableton via MIDI into a drum rack, the latency is going to create an audible flam between the drum and the sample. I like to get around this with a plugin called App Trigger. It uses an audio track, which I called Snare Trigger. The trigger is plugged directly into the interface into input 8, which is enabled here. I'm going to drag the plugin to the track. I have a preset that I created for snares. This just has some settings that's good for snare drums. Now I can get a sample. I have a clap here. And drag it into the box. So now, if I hit the drum, the sample will fire. The thing with triggers is that they can kind of destroy your dynamics, because you don't really want them to fire most of the time on every single ghost note and fill. And a lot of times you only really need them on certain beats. Like with snares, I find myself only needing snare triggers on backbeats, like if it's a tambourine or a clap that I get on a backbeat in a chorus. You can dial that in your trigger module, like with sensitivity and threshold, but I've found that it's actually pretty tough to do. Like if you do that in a rehearsal, and then you go to a gig and you're playing in front of a bunch of people and you play differently, or even if you play softer, like, maybe you have lower energy one night, sometimes they're not going to respond like you want. So if I want to do something like this, to get the trigger to only respond on the backbeats, I'm going to automate the threshold. So if I hit this drum and slowly raise the threshold, it's going to reach a point where the sample will not fire. So I'm going to ratchet the threshold up all the way at all times except for on the backbeats. To display a parameter in a plugin that can be automated, click this little triangle. Here's the threshold. We're going to right-click, show the automation in a new lane. Here's a bar. This is beat 2. So here's the 8th note, there's the 16th note, there's the 32nd. I'm going to turn it on a 30-second note before the backbeat, so we're really only getting that backbeat. I'm going to turn it off a 30-second note after. And that's our automation. We can just copy and paste that as many times as we want, select it, Apple D. And if I open up the plugin, you can see the automation run. Let me make that a little smaller, re-enable automation, and check it out. So it's only opening on the backbeats. And I'll just play that so you can hear it. That was great. The next tip is nesting drum racks within an instrument rack. And this is really useful if you have a bunch of songs in a show and every song has a different bank of drum sounds. Or even if within a single song you need different banks of drum sounds, like from a verse to a chorus or from the chorus to the bridge. So the first thing I'm going to do to set this up is grab a drum rack and drag it onto a MIDI track. Then I'm going to select the drum rack and hit Apple G for group. This creates an instrument rack that the drum rack is nested within. I can select the drum rack and hit Apple D, duplicate, for as many songs that are in my set. Select each one and hit Apple R for rename. And just rename them to whatever your song titles are. You can rename the drum racks themselves as well. Now, to get Ableton to send MIDI to only one drum rack at a time, we have to look at the chain selector. By default, all of these drum racks have chain selector value 0, and the chain selector is also at 0. So that means that if I hit any pad, the MIDI note it sends is going to go to all 3 drum racks at once, which is not what we want. We want each one to have their own chain selector value, so that if I select one of them, MIDI is only routed to one drum rack at a time. And like a lot of parameters in Ableton, this can be automated. If you right-click and click Show Automation in a new lane, this brings up the automation lane. And it also shows the automation in the main track, but I prefer to view automation in lanes because if I'm editing multiple parameters at once, like multiple pads, it's just easier to see them. So let's say I have a song here and a song here and a song here. I want this drum rack in the first song, this drum rack in the second song, and this one in the third song. My automation line is already at 1. That's because the chain selector is at 1, but there's no automation drawn, and the line is dotted to show that. If I click and make a point just before song 2, Now there's a red dot that shows up. That means that there's automation on this line. And I can make it go to 2 there. And now, when this transition happens, the chain selector is going to move from drum rack number 1 to drum rack number 2. And we can see this happen in real time. Here we are at 1. And then it goes to 2. The next tip is nesting instrument racks within drum racks on drum rack pads. And this is really useful if you only need 1 or 2 pads to change at a time. Say you have the same bank of drum sounds for the entire song, except you get a different snare on the bridge. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag some samples into this drum rack. I have some kicks here. And the first thing I do when I drag a sample into a drum rack is put the velocity to 0 and the volume to 0. And the reason I do that is because I found that in most pop contexts, most of the drum samples are pretty much at 100. They don't really tend to have a ton of dynamics. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, and sometimes you do have to dial in some velocity, but this is a pretty good starting point in most cases. So I'm going to do the same thing here that I did with the drum rack before. Select the simpler device and hit Apple G for group. This creates an instrument rack on the drum rack pad. I can rename this. I'm going to call it kicks. And that renames the pad as well. Now I can drag in my other samples. And similarly to the drum racks, we want to give them all their own chain selector value so that only one of them receives MIDI at a time. And when you drag a sample into an instrument rack as opposed to a drum rack, it puts the simpler in a different preset. It puts it in classic mode with a filter and LFO on. So we just want to match all these settings to make sure that all the samples respond the same way. Put it in one-shot mode, turn the filter off, turn the LFO off, velocity 0, volume 0, one-shot, filter, LFO. And of course, we can automate this chain selector as well. So let's say that in this song, we start with a verse and then we get a chorus somewhere, and then somewhere we get a bridge. And maybe we want the first kick until the chorus, and then we get the second one, and then at the bridge we get the third one. Right click, show the automation in a new lane. And just before the chorus, we're going to go to 2. We're already at 1 because that's where the chain selector is. Make a point, bring it up to 2. And then in the bridge, we're going to go to 3. Just before the bridge, bring it up to 3. So now if I let this automation run, you can watch the chain selector move and you'll hear the samples changing as well. And of course, after the first chorus, you're probably actually going to get a verse and then a chorus, and you're going to have to go down to 1 and then back up to 2 and then to 3. But you can draw the automation however you need it for your song. And actually, in a lot of cases, I have pads flipping back and forth every other beat or every other bar. This is common, like if on beat 2 there's a snap and on beat 4 there's a clap, or beat 4 has a separate layer or something, you can just make the automation as quick as you need it to be. Another really useful feature of drum racks are the built-in sends and returns. And producers use these all the time to send individual drum sounds to effects like reverbs and delays. And this can also be done live with automation, like if you want to do a reverb throw on a snare at a certain point in a song. I mostly use them in a more utilitarian way, which is to send things that have a lot of sub-information out a separate output, because it's really useful for front of house and monitors to get things like 808s and kicks down a different line so they can process them differently from things like shakers and hi-hats. So to set this up, first thing I'm going to do is display the I/O and the returns with this little R. That brings up a box that says drop audio effects here. Right click in the box and create a return chain. Select the return chain, Apple R to rename, and I'm going to call it kicks because this is my kick return. Now I can route the pad to this return. These drum rack returns can also be routed to external returns in the session. Currently it's set to rack output, which is just the MIDI track that the drum rack is in. We want to send this to a different output. Currently I just have these two built-in returns available. Those are the returns that every Ableton session opens with. So I'm going to create a new one. Right click and select Insert Return Track. Apple R rename, and we'll call it Kicks. Now I can route this drum rack return to the kick return in the session. And let's say I want to send another output of drums, like for snares. I'm going to create another return track. Apple R, let's call it snares. So I have some snares here. I'm going to drag them onto a drum rack pad. Start with one. And I could actually route this straight out of return, just the one sound, but I'm going to make it an instrument rack because normally I do have multiple samples on any given pad. And I'm going to rename, drag my other samples in, give them each their own chain selector value. And adjust all the settings. Velocity 0, volume 0, one shot, filter, LFO. Now I have to create another return in the drum rack for the snares. And I can route the pad to that return. I'm going to route the return to the return in the session. So if I hit these pads, they should come out their respective returns. There's the kick meter and the snare meter. The last step is to send the returns out of different outputs. That's the whole point of this, is to be able to send different sounds out of different outputs. So I'm going to select them both, send audio to external out, and select our outputs. Now I have all these outputs available, and I'm going to assume that playback is going to come out of 1 through 6. So I'm going to send my drums out of 7 and 8. One really important thing to think about when you're running MIDI instruments and automation and playback, especially when all those things are in the same session, is the load on the CPU. You don't want anything that's taxing the CPU unnecessarily. MIDI instruments, just by being on and idling, use CPU power. Now, truth be told, drum racks are pretty minimal when it comes to CPU when you compare them to like a soft synth like Omnisphere or Trillion or anything like that. But it's just good practice to try to minimize wherever you can and keep your session as lean as possible. So we can do this with automation as well. We're going to turn all the drum racks off when they're not needed. This is the drum rack on-off button, and if you right-click, you'll see that it can be automated. So let's show the automation for that. And we're going to want song 1's drum rack only on during song 1. I'm going to make a MIDI clip, Apple Shift M, and this MIDI clip is going to hold all our automation for this song. I'm going to turn the drum rack off, select the whole MIDI clip, and use arrow down to go down to the automation lane. Now I can grab the whole line and bring it up. The red dot appears that shows the parameters automated. And now drum rack number 1 is only going to be on during that song. So I can repeat this for the other songs. Song 2, we're going to show the automation, make a MIDI clip, mouse down, turn it off, bring it up, and same thing for song 3. All right. So if I hide all of these lines, you can see the automation work. And they're just turning their respective drum racks on for the right song. So I'm going to go to song 1, put the playhead here, and you can see that song 1 is on song 2 is off, and song 3 is off. If I go to song 2, song 1 is off, song 2 is on, song 3 is off, and so on and so forth. Lost my train of thought. The next tip is actually a playback tip, because a lot of times MIDI instruments and playback go hand in hand, and drummers are often asked to run playback. Here I have some stems loaded into this session, and the track is split into 4 groups: bass, drums, synths, and vocals. And each group is running out of its own pair of outputs. Bass is coming out of 1, 2, drums out of 3 and 4, synths out of 5 and 6, and vocals out of 7 and 8. And the reason for that is for separation at front of house and monitors. All these things are going to sound really different from night to night in different rooms, and it's best to give them to them all separately so that they can process them differently. The thing with this is that if you're not plugged into the playback interface and you're listening from your headphone port on your computer, all you're going to hear is what's coming out of 1, 2, which is bass. That's what we hear now. So if you have to edit the tracks, if you're on a bus or in a plane or in a van, you don't have the playback interface available, one quick way is just to reroute everything to 1, 2. And now we hear everything. The problem with this, though, is that you can't reroute them back to where they were if you don't have that interface plugged in. And it's a practical consideration. The next time you're plugged into that interface might be during a really fast changeover at a festival or a super quick line check where you have a bunch of other things going on. And speaking from experience, the last thing I want to be doing in a situation like that is an administrative task like rerouting the outputs in the session. I don't want to think about it. All I want to do is plug the computer in, turn it on, and go. So I like to do this with a return track. I'm going to reroute all these things back to where they were, create a return track, and call it playback. Now I can send these tracks to the playback return. I don't have to send the bass because it's already coming out of 1, 2. So now, if I hit play, we'll hear everything. So you can make your edits, hear everything, and when you're done, just disable the playback return. Now we're back to normal and we just hear the bass. If you want to be really careful about it, you can pull the fader down on the playback return. So even if it gets enabled again by accident, you're still good. You're not going to hear anything else. I hope you find these tips helpful when you go to set up your Ableton session. Most of the drum sounds I used in this video can be found in my loop pack with Lander. So if you like what you heard, be sure to check that out. And if you'd like to work with me on your project, hit me up on Lander Network.